A lot of people hear Russian rocket and picture a single gray cylinder roaring off a snowy launch pad. But the real story is a chain of machines that begins with fear of nuclear war and ends with quiet, routine rides to orbit. The Soviet rocket program did not start as a space program at all. It began as a brutal math problem. How do you throw a heavy warhead across an ocean through the thin upper atmosphere on a trajectory that no airplane can intercept and no air defense system can stop? Out of that question came the R-7, a vehicle that was supposed to terrify cities, and instead became a ladder humanity used to climb off the planet. The R-7 was unlike anything the world had seen. Instead of one fat core like the German V2, it was 5 bodies bound together, 4 tapered boosters around a central stage, all of them lit on the pad at the same time. Clustering engines this way let the designers avoid the nightmare of igniting a new stage in the middle of flight. They simply dropped the empty side boosters when they were done and let the core keep burning. Getting those boosters to separate cleanly was a problem straight out of a watchmaker's nightmares. When they staged correctly, they fell away in a perfect expanding cross, a brief pattern in the sky that would later be called the Korolev Cross, after Sergei Korolev, the chief designer who oversaw the system. Korolev and his team were working under a government that wanted an intercontinental missile, and at the same time, a way to shock the world. They chose kerosene and liquid oxygen for propellants because factories could make them in bulk, and engineers understood their behavior. Valentin Glushko, the master of engines, faced the limit of how big a single combustion chamber could be before it shook itself apart. His answer was to split the engine into smaller chambers that shared pumps and plumbing. From the outside, an R-7 booster looks like it has 4 engines, but it is really a single power plant with 4 nozzles feeding off the same heart. When the Soviet leadership realized how far this machine could throw a payload, they stopped thinking only about warheads. They bolted a small sphere on top, packed it with radios, and named it Sputnik. In October 1957, that polished ball became the first artificial satellite. It did not do much more than beep and tumble, but the psychological impact was enormous. 4 years later, a Vostok variant of the same rocket lofted Yuri Gagarin into orbit inside a cramped metal ball with barely enough room to move his arms. The vehicle beneath him still carried the bones of a nuclear missile, but its mission had become something else, proving that a human being could survive the speed and the heat of space. The R-7 family kept evolving. Vostok gave way to Voskhod, then to Soyuz, each generation adding capability, more precise guidance, better life support, docking hardware, escape systems that could drag the crew away from a failing booster. Yet, if you put photos of the first R-7 and a modern Soyuz side by side, the family resemblance is obvious. The Soviet Union fell, the rocket did not. Soyuz kept flying through the 1990s, through the grounding of the American shuttle, through mergers and sanctions and budget crises. For years, if you wanted to put a person into orbit, Soyuz was the only ticket available. The launcher that began life as a weapon of last resort turned into a remarkably reliable taxi. Running parallel to that workhorse was something much more brutal: Proton. Where Soyuz was relatively compact and burned kerosene and oxygen, Proton was a massive 3-stage column that inhaled toxic hypergolic propellants. Its first stage engines drank unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide, chemicals that ignite on contact without a spark. For the people who have to stand near the pad, this mixture is a nightmare. A leak is dangerous to breathe and even to stand downwind from. Proton was designed in the 1960s as a carrier for giant nuclear warheads, but like the R-7, it was quickly redirected towards space exploration. It hurled heavy pieces of space stations into orbit, lofted interplanetary probes toward Mars and Venus, and later carried large communications satellites into high orbits. The same brute strength that made it suitable for city-destroying bombs made it perfect for lifting thick, armored spacecraft and dense fuel tanks. Its staging was simpler than the clustered R-7. One fat core dropped, then another, each giving way to a smaller stage on top. The trade-off was environmental hazard and a failure record that sometimes left a contaminated crash site that had to be cordoned off and cleaned. The most ambitious Soviet rocket never completed a successful mission. That distinction belongs to the N-1, the lunar booster designed to beat the Americans to the moon. Where the American Saturn V used 5 enormous F-1 engines on its first stage, the N-1 scattered 30 smaller engines in a huge ring. On paper, this promised even more total thrust. In practice, 30 engines meant 30 potential points of failure, a thicket of plumbing, and an extraordinarily complex control problem. Without the time, money, test infrastructure to fire full first stage on the ground, each launch attempt became something close to a full-scale experiment. 4 times the N-1 left the pad, 4 times it exploded. Those failures did not just destroy hardware, they crushed morale. Engineers who had spent their lives climbing toward the moon suddenly found themselves working on documents that would never leave a filing cabinet. The party could not admit defeat publicly, but when American astronauts planted flags and drove rovers across lunar dust, the writing was plain. The Soviet answer was to pivot. If they could not win the race to a single spectacular landing, they could dominate long-term presence in orbit instead. Out of that pivot came Soyuz and later Mir, multi-module space stations assembled piece by piece in low Earth orbit. Soyuz ferried crews. Proton hauled up heavy modules packed with air, equipment, and solar arrays. The focus shifted from planting flags to learning how to live in microgravity for months at a time, studying how the body changes, how materials behave, how closed-loop life support can be built and maintained. This work was quieter than a moon landing, but it laid the foundation for the continuous human presence on the International Space Station decades later. At the high end of ambition, Energia was the last great roar of the Soviet heavy-lift dream. It was a modular, super-heavy launcher built around a central hydrogen-burning core and 4 strap-on boosters closely related to the Zenit medium-lift rocket. Each booster carried an RD-170, one of the most powerful liquid engines ever flown, with 4 chambers fed by a single set of turbomachinery. Energia flew only twice, once carrying a military payload, once carrying the Buran spaceplane on an automated orbital flight. Both missions proved that the stack worked. Neither was followed by a regular flight program. The Soviet economy was collapsing. The wall in Berlin was coming down. Priorities were shifting from prestige missions to basic survival. Below the giants, there was an entire zoo of smaller launchers. Cosmos converted early short-range missiles into light-duty orbital rockets. In the post-Soviet era, Dnepr and Rockot repurposed retired intercontinental missiles by swapping nuclear warheads for satellite dispensers. A silo built to wait for the end of the world became a commercial launch site, its doors sliding open to send weather satellites, Earth imaging craft, and university payloads upward instead of mushroom clouds. Zenit sits in the middle of this family tree as both an independent rocket and a component. Developed in Ukraine with Soviet backing, it was intended as a modern, partially automated medium-lift vehicle. It later became the core of the Sea Launch system, firing from a converted oil platform at the equator to take advantage of Earth's rotational speed. At the same time, Energia's side boosters were effectively overbuilt. Zenit's bolted to a larger tank. Politics and money kept Zenit from reaching its potential, but it showed how modular design could let one engine family and one structural concept serve multiple roles. After the Soviet Union dissolved, the Russian space program inherited hardware, people, and obligations, but lost a great deal of guaranteed funding. Baikonur, the legendary cosmodrome, now sat on the territory of independent Kazakhstan and had to be leased. Many factories and design bureaus were suddenly in a different country. The response was conservative. Soyuz continued hauling crews. Proton carried the heaviest payloads. Smaller rockets based on leftover missiles filled specialized niches. Ambitious new designs lived mostly in drawings and scale models. Angara is the clearest attempt to break that pattern. Conceived as a modular family that could replace both Proton and some Soyuz missions, Angara is built from a common core that can fly alone or in clusters. The engines burn kerosene and liquid oxygen rather than hypergolics, which reduces toxic fallout and makes launches more acceptable to both the public and host governments. The smallest version, using a single core, can loft light satellites. A cluster of cores can handle much heavier payloads. Development dragged on for years, interrupted by funding cuts and shifting requirements, but test flights have slowly accumulated. If it reaches steady, affordable operation, Angara could finally retire Proton and take over many of the tasks that still rely on designs from the 1960s. What sets the Soviet and Russian rocket lineage apart is not just technical creativity, but stubborn continuity. The same basic structural ideas and engine philosophies reappear over and over, tuned and updated but rarely discarded outright. Clustering engines to avoid combustion instability, reusing a proven airframe across many missions, accepting unpleasant propellants in exchange for storage life and performance, building families of vehicles around a common core stage. These are patterns, not accidents. They reflect a world where factories, training pipelines, and political expectations form constraints just as real as gravity and atmospheric drag. It is easy to romanticize these machines as symbols of national pride or ideological competition, but in day-to-day reality, they are equipment. They break, they get patched, they fly again. Flight controllers watch rows of numbers crawl across screens, knowing that behind every figure is a physical part somewhere on a vehicle hurtling downrange. When a mission is successful, they move on to the next one. When a mission fails, they pick through twisted metal, read telemetry, and change procedures until the same failure mode is less likely to recur. From a distance, the story looks like a sequence of milestones. First satellite, first man, first woman, first spacewalk, first long-duration station, first modular station. Up close, it is more like reading a maintenance log. New engines are introduced, then derated for longevity. Upper stages are stretched. Guidance systems quietly shift from analog to digital. Each small change buys a little more reliability or a little more payload. None of them is glamorous. And most never make it into documentaries. But together they are the difference between a prototype and a workhorse. Seen that way, the Soviet and Russian rockets are not relics from a lost empire or props in a Cold War drama. They are long-running industrial projects that have learned, sometimes painfully, where their limits are. They show what happens when you push complexity too far without testing, when you trade environmental safety for performance, when you build a superb machine but cannot afford to keep flying it. They also show what happens when you keep a solid design, train thousands of people to operate it, and let it age into something almost boring in its reliability. In the background of every launch photograph is a culture of engineering that understands both disaster and routine, and keeps showing up at the pad anyway, shift after shift, year after year,